Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the latest in our series of First Thursday Club talks from RSK Biocensus. My name is John Davis. I'm a director at RSK Biocensus and also at the sister companies of Nature Positive and RSK Wilding. And today I'm very happy to be introducing you to Ross O'Donovan, who is a director in Nature Positive, who's going to be talking to us about sustainability in the rail industry. In particular, Ross joined us from Network Rail about 6 months ago, where he was previously head of environment and sustainability, and he was fundamental in working towards developing a 30-year strategy, sustainability strategy for Network Rail, and that included issues such as biodiversity and climate change, decarbonisation, and the circular economy. And so I think he's probably pretty well placed to talk to us today about the challenges that the rail industry faces in becoming truly sustainable. So Rossa, if you could possibly just pass on to the next slide. I will go through the normal housekeeping rules, which most of you will be very familiar with. So you will all be muted at the moment. So if you are screaming at the screen, I can't hear you and we won't be able to hear you. However, if you want to ask questions of Rossa, please do. You can use the questions box on your control panel, so put your questions in there. I will be sifting through those whilst Rossa is talking, and at the end of about 20 to 30 minutes, depending how long his talk takes, we will then have a Q&A session for the next 15 minutes or so. So the whole thing will be wrapped in about 45 minutes. If we don't get through all of the questions, then we will be able to get back to those people whose questions we haven't answered by email. And finally, we will be sending out an email about an hour after the broadcast, which will be asking you for feedback through a questionnaire. It really is just 2 or 3 questions. It would be great for us if you could take a look at those and give feedback on just the whole process, but also if you've got any ideas for future webinars, we'd be extremely happy to consider them. Great. Okay, well, let's leave it there. I shall now hand over to Rossa. Rossa, thank you so much for doing this. If you want to turn off your screen, I will mute myself and turn off my screen, and I'll leave it to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you everyone for coming today to hear me talk about sustainability challenges in the rail industry. John's given me a good introduction as to my role in the rail industry. And so today I'm going to talk about a number of topics. I'm going to talk about Network Rail's environmental sustainability strategy and what that sort of contains. I'm also going to talk about the traction decarbonisation network strategy, which was a key piece of work, which was looking at how to decarbonise traction on the railway. Then I'm going to talk about the Williams-Shapps plan for rail, which sort of came out after the strategy was produced, and followed by the Department for Transport Rail policy statement. And then I'm going to sort of wrap it up and give my personal view of what I think the sustainability challenges in the rail industry are. So from a Network Rail strategy point of view, it's basically has 4 pillars. The first one is low emissions railway, and it's supported by another piece of work, a decarbonisation strategy, if you like. This pillar is, and it's something that the Network Rail did fairly early on. Was in fact before the strategy was actually published, was to set science-based targets for net zero, which they said they could do by 2050. And they were, at the time, the first railway in the world to actually set science-based targets to the 1.5 degrees C global warming scenario. And it was very heartening to see that the board, Network Rail's board and executive leadership team, got behind this and felt, proud of the fact that they'd set those targets. So that was really, really great to have that support. Obviously, in order to Network Rail's a large, complex organisation, and in order to decarbonise, like many other large organisations, an awful lot of things that need to be done. So switching the road fleet was one of them. I think Network Rail's got a road fleet of about 8,500 vehicles. And initially, the strategy said that it would, reduce or transition to ultra low emission vehicles first by 2035, and then to zero emission vehicles thereafter. But the government came back and challenged Network Rail and said that they needed to go faster. And so the the policy now, I think, is to accelerate the transition to 100% zero emission vehicles, and much sooner than 2035. Network Rail obviously has a large estate, lots of buildings, and the energy efficiency of those buildings, some of which are hundreds of years old, heritage buildings, really needs to start looking at energy efficiency in those settings, and to see what they can do to reduce both electricity use, but also to transition away from gas. It's important to note that currently not all stations are operated by Network Rail. There's only 20 managed stations, which are sort of main stations that you sort of come into, terminus stations. Also, from a non-traction point of view, non-traction energy point of view, they wanted to purchase 100% renewable non-traction electricity by 2020, and indeed they did that. They did actually move using REGOs into non-traction 100% renewable, but also then to aim to feed in 100% of non-traction energy from renewable sources by 2030. So to actually use solar panels, other wind turbines, what have you, to actually generate energy and feed it into Network Rail's buildings directly. And also to look at to update their procurement model so that they can reduce value chain emissions, because quite a lot of companies' emissions will sit in their value chain. And then there's other things that could be done. So, for example, could start looking at timetable options for carbon efficiencies. If you ran the trains differently, if you ran them more slowly, you could use an awful lot less energy, and you could get carbon efficiencies that way. And then another big challenge, which I think a lot of people are grappling with, not only in the rail industry, but across the UK and indeed the world, is whole life carbon assessments. So much embodied carbon in all of the products that we use and the infrastructure that we rely on, that we need to understand how much carbon was in those, and to start moving from just understanding embodied carbon and start thinking about whole life carbon. So the design, the commissioning, the building, and the sort of disposal at the end of life. Another sort of target for the environmental sustainability strategy was to get the traction decarbonisation network strategy approved by 2020, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later. And also to start thinking about trials of biomode hydrogen battery trains and rolling out more widespread trials, and then to get an investment decision for electrification of mainline routes by 2029. And I'll talk a bit more about that in more detail a bit later. Air quality is also an issue, and this sort of sits within the low emissions pillar. And Network Rail does have air quality problems in certain areas, in certain stations, certainly covered stations that have diesels coming in and out of them. And it's not very nice if you're sitting on a train waiting for it to go and diesel fumes are coming into the cab, or you're standing waiting on a platform. Birmingham New Street particularly is one station that's received a lot of publicity for poor air quality. And so the target here was to start setting up an air quality monitoring regime, not only for stations but for work sites and depots as well. Obviously, workers working in depots, maintaining trains and so on, can be exposed to harmful pollutants as well. And also then to get air quality improvement plans in place for all managed stations, which they're hoping to do by the end of this control period. They set an initial target because there wasn't really a baseline to actually work from. The initial target was to reduce harmful pollutants by 25% by 2030, and for all appropriate plants, work sites, depots to have adequate dust suppression in place. Climate change adaptation is really important for Network Rail. You have heard of the Dawlish, where the railway track got washed away several years ago due to storm surges. There's been other incidents on the railway where extreme weather has actually caused embankment collapses and even derailment of trains, and sadly even deaths from those derailments. And but this is a massive problem for Network Rail. It's a massive problem for any infrastructure operator. So it's not, I can't just single out Network Rail, but if you think the railway is in places hundreds of years old. When the infrastructure was built, in some cases, climate change wasn't an issue, and so the engineering standards of the time were considered to be adequate. But as weather, as climate changes, weather becomes more extreme, that infrastructure needs to operate to much higher conditions, basically much more stringent conditions. And there's a lot of infrastructure out there, so and it's going to take time and it's going to take money in order to actually sort of update that infrastructure to more, to future climate conditions. So there's a need to update all asset policies and standards, so that they reflect the long-term climate change projections. But there's also a need to actually understand where the problems are. So they need to understand where the most critical assets are. They also need to understand where the most vulnerable assets are and map them accordingly so that they can prioritise where work needs to take place in order to make it more resilient to climate change. It's not all going to happen overnight, so in the meantime there needs to be an understanding that the train service will be affected during periods of extreme weather, and so need to understand what's an acceptable level of service for trains during those conditions. On very windy days, trains will slow down, obviously, and in periods of flooding as well, it might affect service at the moment. But we need to understand, agree with the government what that appropriate level of service is. And Network Rail now is split into 5 regions, and they understand their part of the railway best, so they're in the right appropriate place to be able to develop their own long-term adaptation pathway strategies, and importantly identify the level of investment that's going to be required for the different scenarios, and the plan is to have that done by 2029. From a biodiversity point of view, by the time the strategy was published, the Biodiversity Action Plan had already been prepared, and this was prepared in response to a couple of incidents, but the most important one probably was Hadley Wood, where a lot of trees were cut down to the ground, back to the fence line. It caused a bit of an outrage from the local residents, and the government launched a review which was led by John Varley, who started looking at vegetation management practices in Network Rail. And his report was hugely helpful from a biodiversity point of view, because he went beyond just the vegetation management remit and started talking about biodiversity. And so he set targets for no net loss for biodiversity and net gain for biodiversity for Network Rail. And off the back of that, a sustainable land use program was launched, and that started then to actually to do things like create a new standard for biodiversity, and to start establishing a baseline of biodiversity across Network Rail. And indeed that work's underway at the moment, and all that data then will need to be shared with the supply chain, so that when the supply chain come in to actually do the vegetation management, they're aware of what biodiversity is there, and they can start thinking about how they can actually preserve or enhance that biodiversity, rather than just using the old techniques of just sort of clear felling trees from a safety point of view. Another important aspect of the biodiversity pillar is to increase ecological capability. I think when I joined Network Rail, there was only a handful of ecologists, but was pleased by the time that I'd left, that number had grown considerably. And if you want to manage vegetation from an ecological point of view, you need ecologists to do it. So you need them to actually interpret what's there, and to actually sort of help work with the vegetation management contractors to actually get them to do things in the right way, and enhance biodiversity. And so whilst John Varley set the Network Rail a target of no net loss, or sorry, net gain by 2040, when we were writing the strategy, I said we can do better than that. We should bring that forward to 2035. And whilst that seems like a long time away, it's still quite a big challenge for Network Rail, I think, to actually do that, given that they've got 52,000 hectares of land over something like 20,000 mile corridor. And quite rightly, Network Rail want to be recognised as a leader in land management, and indeed won an award last week from the Union of International Railway Union, which was really nice to see. The final pillar then is sustainable use of materials. If you think of Network Rail, it's as I said, it's a large, complex organisation. It's got a huge value chain. It must use thousands of products, on a daily basis, from thousands of suppliers from all over the world. So, it's really important to actually understand, sustainability credentials, I suppose, of the products that they're using. And it's not really something that they looked at before, because they were using a linear waste model, just trying to avoid, sending waste to landfill, which was obviously very laudable, but the world's moved on since then. And so now they've started a process of mapping and prioritising the materials that they got in their value chain and their waste streams, and to start putting in a circular economy policy for reducing resource use and waste. And then to adapt the many standards that Network Rail has to include circular economy aspects. So it's all sort of built into the whole sort of governance process of Network Rail. But also then to embed that material reuse and deployment systems, tools, etc., into the procurement process as well. So you're actually sort of building it in at the front end as it's being procured. Then you're making sure that the products that you're using are the most, sustainable you've got that are available at the time. But then also to start thinking about, it's not just at the procurement stage, but go a step earlier, start thinking about design stage, and before you start thinking about procurement, to embed circularity metrics into decision making as well, so that the right materials, the right solutions are being used when work is being planned. And their target then is to reuse, recycle, or redeploy all non-hazardous infrastructure materials by 2029. And again, that will be a huge undertaking for Network Rail. So I mentioned the traction decarbonisation network strategy. This was produced in response to a challenge by Joe Johnson, who challenged the rail industry to get diesel trains off the network by 2040, in both in the UK and Wales. Scotland had already committed to do this by 2035, and what you find with the rail industry is Scotland is generally more ahead of the curve, if you like, than England and Wales from a sustainability point of view, and have got actually looking to decarbonise to get to net zero by 2045 instead of 2050. It's worth saying at this point that rail's responsible for only a very small amount of the UK's greenhouse gas emissions. It's about 1.4% according to DFT figures, but traction diesel accounts for the greatest proportion of this. So electric traction is supplied by nuclear energy. When Network Rail were actually setting their science-based targets, they classed this as zero emissions because it came from nuclear. When the RSSB were looking at the decarbonisation of the railway, they produced a report called T1197, decarbonising the railway, I think it was called. But they classified it differently because although the energy does come from nuclear, it's not additional to the energy that's already produced within the network. But anyway, the outcome of the traction decarbonisation network strategy was a great piece of work, by the way. It was really interesting to read, and they clearly worked very hard on it. But what they concluded was that you'd need to electrify about 11,700 single track kilometres for long distance high speed passenger and freight services. That about 900 single track kilometres could be used, you could run hydrogen trains instead of electrification, and for 400 single track kilometres you could use battery trains. And for the remaining 2,400 single track kilometres, there was no clear choice of technology. So they looked at that residual 2,400 single track kilometres and came up with, well, another 1,340 SDKs could be electrified, 400 SDKs could be hydrogen, 400 could be battery, and the remaining 260 SDKs, the technology choices yet to be made. So a great study. If you ever get the chance to read it, it's really interesting. So following the strategy, following the TDNS, the Williams-Shapps plan for rail was published, and that had been going on for a couple of years. There's a white paper published in 21, and it made a series of commitments for the rail industry. The first one was about integrating the railways, and that was probably the biggest, the most impactful commitment they made. And that was to get, to basically replace Network Rail with an organisation called Great British Railways, which would then bring the whole of the railway together under the leadership of one organisation. And they called for Great British Railways to actually set out a 30-year strategy, and which is now currently being prepared. It's called the Whole Industry Strategic Plan. They also talked about replacing franchising, so the trains would then come under more direct control of Network Rail, even if there were contracts to specific train companies, it would be handled in a different way. They also talked about a new deal for passengers, and Network Rail is very mindful of how its passengers feel. There's an awful lot of work goes on to actually understand, what passengers want and what they're disgruntled about. And so things such as frictionless payments, pay-as-you-go journeys, digital tickets, simplified fares, flexible season tickets were all sort of important issues that came up with passengers, but also the idea of joined up public transport service and promotion of cycling. So making sure you've got a sustainable, your journey from home to station to wherever you're going is the most sustainable possible. So you're actually, you have a joined up public transport system. There's more provision for cycling. Stations are a lot more accessible. The white paper also talked about unleashing the private sector's potential. The government sees the private sector as having a big role to play in actually helping to fund and invest in the railway. But also accelerating innovation and modernisation. So there's lots we can do to make the railway more sustainable, such as electrification, hydrogen battery trains we've already talked about, and they call for a comprehensive environment plan by 2022. So I believe that's being prepared at the moment. I was working on that before I left Network Rail, and it was already at a fairly advanced stage. And also, things like they're going to need to think about energy efficiency, renewable power, tree planting, and investment in climate resilience. So the plan sort of clearly laid out that the environment plan that should consider all of these things. It also talked about empowering rail's people, more training for its staff, better training, and a more diverse workforce. That was followed then by a Department for Transport Rail policy statement, which came out very, very quickly afterwards. And that sets a clear direction for the rail industry on environmental sustainability. The environment plan that's mentioned in the Williams-Shapps white paper is going to be called the Sustainable Rail Strategy, and that's going to cover, in many ways, many of the topics that are in Network Rail's sustainability strategy. So things like traction decarbonisation, quality, non-traction decarbonisation, waste, litter, graffiti, and so on. And it also will cover social value. So Network Rail has its own separate social value framework, which wasn't included in the environmental sustainability strategy to start with. And DFT is keen to see that social values embedded into procurement practices across the network, and empowering community. Specifically talks about empowering community rail partnerships. It also talks about integrated travel and modal shifts. So, there's a need to encourage more passengers onto trains and more freight off the road. It's much more carbon friendly if you get freight off the road onto the rail. For there to be more provision of bicycles at stations and better integration of public services, which I've already mentioned. It also interestingly talked about land use, and from my view, this sort of came out with a sort of fact, we'd sort of launched our own sustainable land use program, and it talked about clean energy generation using Network Rail's estate, which is 52,000 hectares, for clean energy generation, enhanced biodiversity, carbon offsetting, capture and storage. It also talked about railway noise. So Network Rail has the most neighbours of any organisation in the UK, simply because it's a very long, network of infrastructure. And so the DFT was keen that there was some strategic noise mapping, and that was measures were being put in place to actually mitigate that noise. The policy statement also talked about water, so reducing water use, as in potable water use, but also reducing the negative impacts the railway has on water bodies. So if you think about the rail network, it runs either alongside or over many freshwater bodies, and there's always the potential for pollution to escape into those water bodies and harm the ecology that's living in there. So to wrap it up, then, this is again, I say this is my perspective. Other people in Network Rail may have other perspectives, but this is from what I know about Network Rail, what I know about sustainability in the rail industry, what I think the challenges are for the rail industry. And complexity has got to be one of them. It's a huge and complicated industry. It has so many moving parts. It's not always easy to get things done quickly. I quite like to get things moving, get things done, but Network Rail felt like very big wheels turning very slowly, if you like. I think the post-COVID landscape is causing the railway enormous challenges. Things like Microsoft Teams, Zooms, this GoTo webinar that we're on at the moment, they're direct competitors to the rail industry. If you think about it, it allows people to work at home, or either full-time or in a hybrid fashion, and that will ultimately change travel needs and patterns. And with that, it will change people's perceptions on, for example, buying season tickets and wanting more flexible season tickets or different pricing methods on the railways. And ultimately, with more people working from home, more people, less people travelling on the trains, there's going to be less money coming into the railway. Funding, Network Rail gets government funding from the government. It's a tune of something like 38 billion pounds, for CP6, which is Control Period 6, which runs from 2019 to 2024. And the government have publicly stated they want that they're looking for Network Rail to reduce their funding needs for Control Period 7, which starts in 2024, and certainly there was a lot of work going on to actually look at how that could be done. Expertise. So whilst it has been really encouraging to see the number of sustainability professionals and ecologists grow, as during my time at Network Rail, it was really, really great to see the team, grow and people start, the regions to start sort of employing more sustainability professionals to look after the railway. Reducing funding is potentially could lead to a reduction in workforce, number of positions, and therefore the number of sustainability roles, because obviously they need to, if there's less roles available, they need to make sure that the safety and the engineering roles are not understaffed, so that the railway continues to be well maintained and safe. From a traction point of view, obviously the solutions are out there. They've got electrification, hydrogen, battery. Electrification is expensive, but ultimately it's the key to achieving net zero targets, provided you've got a zero carbon energy supply. Hydrogen trains, whilst the proof of principle being proved, they are out there on the network, but they're still in their infancy and they're certainly not widespread. And there's a big question mark over the hydrogen infrastructure in the country, either for trains or for cars or even for boilers. Until that's answered, then hydrogen trains I don't think will be widespread. And battery trains, whilst again the technology has been improved, they have a limited application, they have a limited top speed, they have limited range, and so can only be used on certain services. From a non-traction point of view, so moving away from gas assets will be a challenge, and that's not just a challenge for Network Rail. I think that's a challenge for everybody. You know, replacing gas boilers with something else. No, I don't think anyone's arrived at the right technology yet, and you know, ground source, air source heat pumps are only suitable in certain circumstances, certain situations. On-site renewable energy generation is something that could be used, but it's not feasible everywhere. And I would say that, you know, to do it properly, you'd likely to need direct wire. But is there enough room on the network to be able to do that? So would you then need to actually start doing that on adjacent land to the railway and working with private investors in order to get your sort of direct wire energy supply from there? Energy efficiency will be a challenge as well. You know, Network Rail has a large number of heritage buildings, and you know, once Great British Railways is formed, there will be a lot more stations. So there's be something like 2,500 stations, which will need to be sort of looked at, and there will many of them very old, you know, Victorian era, and sort of making those buildings more energy efficient is always going to be a challenge. Reducing embodied carbon, not just a challenge for the rail industry, it's a challenge for you know, UK PLC, rest of the world as well. And supply chain carbon, scope 3 emissions. Network Rail uses many SMEs and have started to challenge them to actually sort of reduce their carbon emissions and to set their own science-based targets as well. And many of the tier 1 contractors are already starting to do that, but it's the tier 2 and tier 3 contractors which are going to be less able to respond to the sort of decarbonisation challenge. And you know, a new standard that came out said that, you know, contractors needed to start using HVO fuel instead of diesel, but then there's the availability of that is limited, and you know, asking for more production of more HVO fuel could actually lead to unsustainable behaviours within the supply chain. From a land point of view, there's an expectation that the rail estate can be used to do multiple things, and in theory it can, but you know, certainly the DFT are asking for it to generate renewable energy, offset carbon, sequester and store carbon, and achieve BNG, biodiversity net gain, at the same time, and also talk about planting trees. And the problem is woodland isn't the ideal habitat for the railway. Trees, you know, can be dangerous if they fall over, if they're not maintained properly, they can derail trains and so on. And so they need to think about what they can do in that area. There's also the issue of measuring biodiversity and monitoring annual changes in biodiversity net gain at scale, and how to do that both cheaply and safely, and also to retrain the vegetation management contractors to manage in a more biodiverse way. So, you know, for years they've just been working to the same specification, going in, felling trees, you know, and they're doing their job, they're doing what they're told. But we now need to get them to start thinking about how they can do that in a much more biodiverse way. From a weather resilience and climate change adaptation point of view, this is certainly, I think, one of the biggest challenges that the rail industry is facing, certainly probably more than decarbonisation challenge. Much of the, as I said earlier, much of the infrastructure hasn't been built to be resilient to future weather conditions. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to identify where the most vulnerable and critical assets are. And that work needs to be done quickly in order to be able to plan for the future. And that, you know, the costs are likely to be billions over decades. And, you know, in some cases the costs are not known. And with things like sea level rise, they'll have to make difficult decisions as to whether to protect the railway or whether to abandon it and move it inland, which again is, you know, hugely expensive. Certainly what I like to promote when I was at Network Rail was nature-based solutions, and they can help, you know, but they need to be applied probably beyond the railway boundary. There might be areas where you can actually have smaller nature-based solutions on the railway to actually combat things like flooding and erosion and so on. But ultimately, they might need to be applied at either a local or a catchment scale, and that's going to require cross-agency working. But there is, already there's, agencies such as the Environment Agency and so on are starting to think about doing this, joining up their work with other organisations such as Network Rail in order to actually to achieve sort of catchment-wide benefits from a climate change adaptation point of view. And then from a circular economy point of view, obviously, Network Rail needs to move away from the linear waste management model, as does the rest of the rail industry. I think the sheer challenge here is just the huge value chain, which involves, thousands of companies, tens of thousands of products. There's an awful lot of work there to do to actually work out what is the most, resource-friendly, carbon-friendly, water-friendly products out there, and which ones can then be sort of used for a second purpose and then recycled, to get as much of the raw material, the original raw material, out of them as possible. But they have made some inroads into this, and obviously, Network Rail uses an awful lot of ballast, a lot of concrete, a lot of steel. So they're the sort of three big things, and they all have, fairly high carbon footprints, and they're most significant in terms of their both volume and probably carbon density. Network Rail's makes good results, good progress in reusing ballast. They've got ballast cleaning machines that basically pick the ballast up, clean it, and then use it again. Stops it going to landfill, and what's not usable then goes off into the sort of building industry. Rail again tends to be reused, so it can be reused on high-speed lines, and then lower speed lines, and then community railway lines, or then taken away and sort of smelted down and turned into new rail. But if you look out the train window, there's still an awful lot of rail sitting around, which has been sitting there for many years, and it's just too difficult or expensive to pick up and actually reuse, and really that needs to be done. Palisade fencing is the preferred option. If you think of the Network Rail's rail corridor, palisade fencing everywhere, and that's also quite has quite a high carbon footprint. So are there alternatives? There used to be a smaller fence with sort of big thorny hedges used to be used years ago to stop people and livestock coming onto the railway. Could we start thinking about different solutions there? Concrete again is starting to be reused more, and it was really encouraging to see the work going on at Euston and the HS2 terminal there, where they took up the old platforms. They needed to demolish the old platforms and sort of use them and build the new ones, but then they incorporated some of the old concrete into the new platforms and set up a local sort of, if you like, a local urban quarry to sort of deal with it. But in the end, it's such a large area of focus that there's so much more that could be done to become more circular. And I'm going to finish there. So thank you very much, everyone. Happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rossard. Can you stick your camera on?
Yeah.
We had a minor panic whilst you were doing that, because I had a power cut here for 10 minutes whilst you were doing that. So behind the scenes, it was all a bit panicky. But hey, I'm back.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
No, that's fine. You leave that there. That's fine. So I've got a couple of questions for you, which I'll go through. We've got about 6 or 7 minutes. The first thing is, I'm going to ask a question since I'm the moderator and I'm in the chair. It seems there's an awful lot to consider. I mean, there's so much that the rail industry is looking into, which is really great to see. Do you know if other rail networks around the world, around Europe, are doing a similar sort of thing, or are we world leaders in this, as our government likes to say?
So certainly other rail networks are doing other things. Certainly some of the European networks and some of the sort of Asian networks are sort of thinking about sustainability. I mean, there were benchmarks between Network Rail and people like Deutsche Bahn and stuff like that. and you know, they were fairly comparable, really. I think so. Whilst Network Rail might be leading the way in some ways, you know, others are probably leading the way in other ways. But certainly, the fact that Network Rail got an award for the Sustainable Land Use Programme work is really good, because it came from the International Union of Railways, if you like.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, I've had a question here from Ian Townsend, who says, how much current long-distance road-borne freight could be accommodated on the existing rail network, and how big an impact would this have on air quality and carbon emissions?
I don't know the answer to that. That's far too detailed statistics for me to carry around in my head, I'm afraid. Certainly, I can't remember what the statistic was, but it was something like, you know, a freight train sort of replaces something like 74 lorry, you know, HGVs or something like that. So, you know, the calculations are out there. You could look at the Transport Decarbonisation Network strategy that would probably have the answers in it, or even the Department for Transport Rail Policy would probably have those sort of statistics in there as well.
But it is presumably a good thing to get as much road.
Yes,
I mean, I guess if
absolutely.
you're electrifying cars, maybe it's less of a. If you can electrify lorries,
instead of electrifying, you know, HGVs, which is technically very difficult.
Yeah.
You know, you've got a rail network there already. You know, freight can run at night when passengers don't really want to travel. So, you know, it's a case of moving as much freight onto the railways as possible is a no-brainer in my mind.
Yep. Okay, we can go over a little bit, I'm being told, so I'll ask a couple more questions, if I may. This one's of interest to me in particular from my ecology background. In your view, what are the difficulties for monitoring BNG, biodiversity net gain, on the railway?
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I think we thought long and hard about this when we were writing the Biodiversity Action Plan and setting up the Sustainable Land Use Programme. You know, ultimately, the safety of any individual is the most important thing. We've got, you know, you've got 52,000 hectares of land, something like 20,000 miles of rail corridor. It's all very skinny, and you've got trains running up and down it all the time. So the last thing you need is hundreds of ecologists going out and surveying in the traditional way, as you would as if you were doing a development, you know, surveys before a development, housing development, for example. So we sort of needed some other way to actually start to establish the biodiversity baseline at Network Rail. And so we sort of settled on the use of remote sensing, so GIS technology, where we could then map the habitats. And then the idea was that once we've got the habitat map and the methodology for doing that, we can reapply that every 5 years or every 2 years or whatever and see what changes there are. You'd obviously need to go out then and do some spot samples or spot checks, if you like, of certain habitats to make sure that the GIS is telling you what those habitats are and to understand what's actually living in those habitats. And from that, you could sort of build up a picture, if you like, at an index. You're not going to get the full picture, but you'll get something that you could at least measure. And if you reapplied it in the same way year after year, you know, you could at least then get trends. But there's, I mean, other things. So you know, applying the deferometric, for example, wouldn't be appropriate on a railway setting because it's such a long, dangerous rail corridor. But there's other things.
Unless you can do it remotely, presumably.
You could do a lot of this remotely, and you could probably use things like acoustic monitoring and stuff like that to actually, you know, so this is an area for innovation, and certainly it's an area that lots of ecologists are thinking about in terms of innovating. What can we do? What technology can we start using? You know, camera traps are brilliant, aren't they, really, in terms of actually finding out, you know, what mammals are around late at night when you're not there.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've looked into for Network Rail as well, and I think if you are able to properly monitor the increases and decreases in biodiversity across the network, then that's, you know, you're wanting to demonstrate for Network Rail that they are achieving biodiversity net gain. You need a pretty high resolution mapping system in order to allow you to do that on a yearly basis. Anyway, so another one. So how realistic, in your view, is it that the railway estate can be used for multiple purposes? So you did talk about this at the end, such as generating and storing renewable energy at scale, and to offset, sequester and store carbon whilst achieving biodiversity net gain at the same time.
So in an ideal world, you'd want to use your land to the maximum maximum benefit, wouldn't you really, I suppose? But with many things, there's a trade-off, I think. I mean, if for every square meter of solar panels that you have, you've changed the ecology underneath it. Whilst you can use sort of species-rich grassland or whatever, ultimately you want to balance both your energy needs and your biodiversity net gain needs as well. And in some cases, planting trees isn't the answer, because trees can be very problematic in a railway setting. So you then need to come up with a habitat that's basically going to give you that biodiversity net gain advantage, versus and then identify areas where you can actually put your solar panels, areas where you can have climate change adaptation features such as wetlands and so on, and so you can actually get the best out of your land. And in that way, because you've got so many different objectives there to actually achieve, in some ways having just a straight biodiversity net gain target could slightly hamper you, I suppose, in terms of you've got competing objectives, when what you really need to do is to have targets for getting the most sustainable benefit from your land.
Yeah, I mean, this again is something we've been looking at with Network Rail, and it's all about, I think, putting the right thing in the right place. There will be places, for instance, where if Network Rail own land that is of high value for building houses, then they're within their rights to use that land in that way. If it is particularly good for solar or wind, then that makes a lot of sense. I think you can combine the two. You can do biodiversity on areas where you're doing renewables. So it's kind of blending it all together is the key, and getting as many of those.
I mean, and it's a huge estate, and it's grown up over the years. They've sold a lot of land off for housing and development already because of in terms of profitability. But I remember one of the estates directors telling me there's probably something like 4,000 little parcels of land that we can't use commercially, and they're not being used by the railway at the moment. So there's so much potential, but the first thing you need to do is a land study, basically, in order to understand where those bits of land are.
Yeah. Okay. I think we should probably leave it there, since we've run over a little bit. I think I've got through the questions. So all I have to say is thank you very much, Rossa, for that. That was excellent. So much going on. Very, very interesting. Obviously, we will answer any questions that we haven't got through, and you've got Ross's contact details there if you need them. I'm sure he'd be happy to hear from you. Our next First Thursday talk is on the 7th of July, and that's with our colleague, Professor Richard Delahaye, who will be talking about evidence and ecological consultancy, something that is really key to us in RSK Biocensus, the idea of having a properly evidence-based advice on ecology. And so we're setting up various research projects to answer specific questions of interest to our industry. So I think that would be a particularly interesting talk if you're interested in that. As I say, that's the 7th of July. And the last thing to say is that your questionnaire will come through within an hour. If you can possibly get around to answering that, that would be great for us. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much.